confidence for the concept that you made the effort to be here. I teach environmental taxation at Vermont Law School, so I haven't been actively involved in the development of this particular proposal that's coming out in Vermont. But I was asked to give you just a general introduction to carbon taxes to help set the framework for Ben's comments, which will take you into the heart of what you really want to find out about tonight. So I'm going to give you Carbon Taxes 101, the quick overview in 10 minutes of carbon tax theory and how it's been used around the world. But don't worry, there's no quiz at the end of the 10 minutes. So when we talk about environmental protection. Usually in this country, our first instinct is to think about regulation because we've had a really rich history of federal and in Vermont, state regulation. And so we have that instinct, but in fact, there's a really interesting intersection between environmental protection and taxation. And it's that little intersection that we're going to be wandering into tonight. Taxation, I think, has tremendous potential because it sends out the price signals that just affect thousands and millions of decisions every day. Through the tax system, we're able to reach into the pockets of people's minds in ways that can be very effective. With taxation, there's a really simple formula. So this is not the complex stuff of green eye-shade accounting. It's a very basic idea for carbon taxes and really for all taxes. First, you find something you want to tax, your tax base. And then you figure out how much you want to tax it, the tax rate. You multiply the tax base times the tax rate, and you get lots of revenue, if it's a sufficiently large tax. So it's that revenue that's really the purpose of most tax systems. Government needs the revenue for its lifeblood, so it can do what it needs to do to protect our common interest. So carbon taxes are just like any other tax. We tax something at a certain rate and it generates revenue. But carbon taxes are different from most taxes in one respect, and that is that carbon taxes and other environmental taxes are designed to also have some kind of a behavioral effect. And this goes back to 1920 and a British professor named A.C. Pigou, P-I-G-O-U, who thought that our society and economy are not working quite right because we do things that generate costs for other people, for society. And those costs fall on all of the rest of us and aren't reflected in the price. So his idea was, let's have a tax that captures those social costs and puts it back on the activity or the product, so that then, as we're engaging in providing those services or products, we stop and think about what the real cost is to society and and hopefully that will start affecting decision making. So that's the critical idea about a carbon tax. We want to take some of the social costs of greenhouse gas emissions and capture that and put it into a tax so that as we're buying gas or heating our homes, we're thinking about what's the real cost of what we're doing. So that's the grand economic theory that lies beneath environmental taxes. And economists, as Liz said, are pretty unanimous that it's a good idea. But then we hit the reality of implementation. And the good news is that this is a concept that actually has been translated into reality. I'll talk primarily about British Columbia. They've done it, and they've done it really simply and in a way that I think shows you how you can design a carbon tax. So we have to find out what we're going to tax, the tax base. They taxed all of the fossil fuels that are consumed in British Columbia. This story started back in 2007 when the province set a greenhouse gas goal of reducing emissions by 33% by 2020. So they had to figure out how to get there, and the premier decided that one important way to do it would be a carbon tax. So early in 2008, he came out with a proposal to put a tax on all of the fossil fuels consumed in the province. That tax has very few exemptions. It exempts things like fuel that goes into airplanes that are flying into another jurisdiction. That combustion is going to occur outside the province. So that makes sense. So very limited exceptions. In 2012, there's a slight exemption for some agricultural activities, but generally it covers about 70% of all the greenhouse gas emissions in the province. Carbon emissions, methane, and nitrous oxide from the combustion of fossil fuels. So really broad-based. And the tax rate. They started out with a tax rate of $10 a ton, and then raised it each year by $5, so now it's up to $30 a ton. That makes sense to phase it in so it's not too much of a shock to the economy, and people can get used to it and start adjusting their behavior over that 4-year period. Who pays the tax? They put the tax on the point which is technically called upstream. As soon as the fossil fuels enter the stream of commerce in British Columbia, at that point the tax is paid. And you think, well, does that make sense? Because we're really trying to tax emissions. And it's all the end users that actually produce the emissions when the fuel is combusted. But what happens with carbon taxes is that there's a one-to-one correlation between the carbon content in the fuel and the ultimate emissions. So you can tax it early in the process, knowing that those emissions are actually going to be going out there at the end of the line. Taxing it early in the process makes it very easy for the tax administrators. Fewer taxpayers, easy to collect, and in British Columbia that cost gets passed down to the end users. Then, because it's a tax, you get the great question of what are you going to do with the money that you've just generated? In British Columbia now, it generates about $1.2 billion a year. That's a lot of cash. And with a carbon tax, if the tax itself is working well, hopefully behavior is changing. And so you don't necessarily have to use the revenue for any particular purpose. So the choice of how to use the revenue can be governed by politics, by policy. There are a whole set of ways you could use the revenue. What British Columbia did was say, we're going to raise the taxes on fossil fuels, the bads. We're going to use that revenue to reduce the tax rates on income. So we're going to tax the bads in order to give relief to some of the good things. And so it was revenue neutral. Everything that came in was used to reduce other tax rates. That had a couple of benefits. When you have a tax on fossil fuels, you're always going to worry about what's that going to do to lower income people, because you want to be concerned about whether people actually have the ability to pay the tax. So they directed a lot of the tax cuts to lower income taxpayers through reductions in the lower income tax rates and by giving refundable tax credits so that if people, even if people didn't pay taxes, they'd get a rebate back in the mail. And they set it up so that would happen 4 times a year, so people didn't have to wait till the end of the year just to get their tax relief. They also did tax relief for the business sector to avoid the issue of whether this was going to end up hurting the economy. So all of the revenue that came in is used to reduce other tax rates, and then they have a really interesting twist in the plot. People don't always believe government when government says this is going to be revenue neutral. So because they think, well, you say that now, but what happens next year? So they had a provision which says each year the finance minister tells us, has to give us a plan to say how this is going to be revenue neutral and make sure that everything that comes in actually doesn't stay in the public purse. How is that enforced? A 15% pay cut for the finance minister if he or she does not live up to that obligation. So actually how this is played out is that more is going out in tax cuts than in income, just in new tax revenue, to make sure that it's revenue neutral. So that's a quick introduction to British Columbia. It's comprehensive, it's simple, It went into effect quickly. It was announced in February of 2008. It went into effect in July of 2008 because it was building off of an existing tax system. And about 4 months after the tax was announced or went into effect, there was a bit of a revolt from the population. There was an Axe the Tax campaign in the next provincial election, but it survived. The premier who had announced it survived. And it's here to stay. It's been reviewed, and the government is committed to it. It's also been proven to be effective from an environmental point of view, and that's really why we want to do a carbon tax. So there's one study that over the first 4 years of the tax, greenhouse gas emissions have gone down by 17.4% in the province. And that's much more than for Canada as a whole. So it's actually 18.9% more than the province as a whole. So it's changing behavior. You could say, well, that's just British Columbia. But it's happening elsewhere. The Nordic countries have a long tradition of carbon taxes. So you see Sweden since 1991. Their tax rate for households and transportation is now 123 euros. And with the low exchange rates now, that's $139 per ton of carbon emissions, carbon dioxide emissions. So significant tax rate. And over the 20-year period that this has been in effect, the emissions have gone down by 20%. So it's working. Ireland, Switzerland, another example with a different kind of a feature. Its tax rate is adjusted to make sure that Switzerland is reaching its emissions reduction targets. So it started lower, now it's at 60 francs, which is roughly $60, and the government has announced that if there isn't more emissions reduction, it will go up in 2016 to 84 francs, roughly $80+. So it's kind of a self-correcting tax rate. Ireland is another situation, a carbon tax of 20 euros. And there's a carbon trading scheme in Europe, kind of like the regional greenhouse gas initiative here. And there, the carbon tax applies to the fuels that aren't covered by the cap and trade system. So it's a logical complement. And I think one of the interesting things about that is that there, a lot of the political momentum came out of the fiscal crisis following the recession. The government needed money. And so the carbon tax was one way it could get it. Japan, a very small carbon tax, so it doesn't really change behavior, but it generates important revenue for green investments. So you see a lot of activity. There are other countries as well. Bernie Sanders has introduced a carbon pollution fee bill. Hasn't gone anywhere yet, but it's out there in the US. And in just one final slide, you can't read the fine print, but this is a graph done by the OECD. And it looks at the burden of taxes on energy here and on carbon dioxide there, and ranks the countries according to how much tax they're putting on energy and carbon dioxide. Where's the US? Right there. Next to last, compared to just next to last with Mexico being very last. So that gives you a graphic idea of how much we're not doing with carbon and energy pricing. And so then we leave it with the question of what can Vermont do about that? Thank you.